Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another New Jersey Constitutional Republicans Virtual Conversation. It's my great honor and privilege today to have Dr. Jerome Huyler on the phone with us. He doesn't have video capabilities, but we do have audio, and it's great to have you join us, Doctor. How are you today?
Thank you very much for inviting me on. Looking forward to this talk.
Great. Well, it's great to have you, Doctor. And I've already said that we want to have the doctor on at least once a month to talk about a lot of the extensive work that he's written. He's written a great book called Locke in America, The Moral Principles of the Founding Era. And Doctor, to start the interview, why don't you give the audience a little bit of background on yourself? Tell us all about Dr. Jerome Huyler.
Okay, I got my PhD from the New School in New York City, not far from NYU. My PhD is in political science, and I did my doctoral dissertation on the philosophy of John Locke and his influence on the Founding Fathers. At that point, back in the 90s, we were still celebrating the bicentennial of the American founding era, and a great many scholars wanted to, quote unquote, debunk the idea that John Locke was the greatest influence on the Founding Fathers. So I did a 10-year study, which I absolutely confirmed that Locke was the leading philosophical influence on the Founding Fathers. That dissertation became a book in 1995 called, as you say, Locke in America, The Moral Philosophy of the Founding Era. And I went on to write a sequel some years later, which I'm now completing now, in which the University of Kansas Press that published Locke in America is now seriously considering. The sequel will be called The Tragedy of Our History, How the Patriots' America Became the Progressives' America. And it is an amazing story that has never been told. But anyway, I went on to become first an adjunct professor at Seton Hall University, and then a assistant professor. I was there until 2015, teaching political science, moral philosophy, and intellectual history to my classes there. It was a very, very rewarding experience. I did that until 2015, when I guess they found out what my own political views were, and I became a casualty of the cancel culture, I suppose it's safe to say. Since then, I founded and am sole admin for my Facebook group called The American Declaration, and there are a great many posts that are on there that our listeners can review. I will approve anyone who requests to join the Facebook group, The American Declaration. And I'm at work completing The Tragedy of Our History, How the Patriots' America Became the Progressives' America. And as I say, that is a wonderful story, John Robert, that I'm sure your listeners, your viewers, members will be most eager to learn about in coming sessions that we have.
Yes, no question about it, Doctor. And you wanted me to call you Jerome, which I'm going to do, and appreciate you calling me John Robert. And but it's a great pleasure to talk to you, Jerome. Now, are you from New York? Were you born in New York? Where were you raised? Where did you grow up?
I was born in Brooklyn, New York, just down the road from you, and that's where I was raised. That's where I grew up.
Great. Well, that's and you were teaching at Seton Hall, correct? Is that that's where you
that's
were?
Right.
Right, and then you became a casualty of the council culture, which is it's remarkable that you were able to last as long as you did, isn't it?
That is actually very true. But what made it possible is, upon becoming assistant professor, I was made part of a department that was not so much associated with any major. In other words, as assistant professor, I was no longer in the political science department. Seton Hall started a program whereby freshmen and sophomores had to take basic courses. And so I was tasked, one of the professors tasked with teaching those courses. For every freshman had to take a course called Journey of Transformation, which I turned into a course in moral philosophy, teaching the virtues by which I believe every human being should adhere to in order to grow up and be successful. But there was no committee meetings. There was no chair looking over my shoulder. I got great reviews from my students. That's all administration was concerned with. So I didn't have to attend committee meetings. I didn't have to do assignments for the chair of the department or the dean because there was no department of studies for students in this program. So I basically was under the radar for many, many years until I started giving some lectures to students of Seton Hall outside my classes on political topics, and I gave too much away, I suppose. I had not received tenure. I was not on the tenure track, but I was hired year after year, long after I was not supposed to be hired anymore. They just retained me, as I say, until they found out what my views were.
Well, we're certainly glad that you're still very active and helping to educate. You know, one of the primary purposes, Jerome, of the New Jersey Constitutional Republicans is to educate our citizens and educate the voters, essentially making up the difference from the elimination of civics and American history that has been taken out of our public schools, and as you're well aware of, in the institutions of higher education. It's very important that knowledge is being diffused and that people are receiving knowledge. And that's where both of us, you and I, are both very committed in educating our citizens in order to preserve our republic and learn about it. But I want to start, let's talk about John Locke.
I'd like to respond to that.
Go ahead.
I'd like to respond to that and go a little further.
Please.
It's not just that civics is no longer taught in our schools. It's that our culture has been taken over by what I call the 3 time-tested tools of tyranny. So that from the mainstream media, we get a steady stream of propaganda. From our schools, we get indoctrination, and censorship is handled by the whole culture of political correctness that basically is an assault on free thought and expression. And all of that, of course, is coming ultimately from our Ivy League institutions of higher learning, because they teach the next generation of rank and file professors who teach the next generation of journalists and judges and news reporters and everyone else who spreads the culture. So the only way, in my opinion, the only way to really rescue this country is precisely what you just said, John Robert, is reaching what in 2016 we began calling the forgotten men and women of the country, the ordinary men and women who have not lost, the common man has not lost his common sense. And now they are finally learning how important it is to pay attention to what's going on politically, because they see the consequences of not paying attention. And now we have an opportunity like never before to reach the ordinary men. I like a quote by Bertrand Russell, who said that men are born ignorant, not stupid. They are made stupid by education. And that, unfortunately, has been the result in recent decades. And that is what you, I, and thousands of other patriots are fighting to overcome.
Yes, absolutely. And Jerome, wouldn't you say that I call it the two-headed Leviathan of the Frankfurt School, cultural Marxism, and the progressive school that Wilson was an exponent of, and the taking the ideas of the early progressives, along with the influx of cultural Marxists through the Frankfurt School beginning in the 20th century, progressivism beginning in the 19th century. Wouldn't you say that that really is the two-headed Leviathan that has caused a lot of this the ideas of political correctness?
Those are you have it exactly right. Those are the two major influences. The Frankfurt
And they're both
School,
related to Marx.
Absolutely, absolutely. And the common denominator is Marx's view that capitalism entails oppression and exploitation of the many by the few, and that's what the Frankfurt School held on to. That is what progressivism held on to and disseminated, the idea that capitalism is a corrupt system and needs to be overturned because it dabbles in exploitation and oppression. And now we have the Green New Deal, an AOC, which is an extension of both, because we discover Marx thought the only people who were paying the price for capitalism was the exploited workers. Now we learn that it's even the environment that's exploited and oppressed by industrial activity. And that's the common denominator. There are a lot of things that Marx wrote that have gone by the boards. His forecasts proved utterly failed. But the idea that capitalism is nothing but oppression, and that's where cultural Marxism came in to say that every institution of a capitalist society is designed to justify injustice and pacify a gullible populace, because, as Marx said, the ideas of any age are merely the ruling ideas of any age are merely the ideas of the ruling class. There is no truth, there is no fact, there is no reality. There are just ideas designed to keep people down. And that is what was preserved with progressivism, especially with John Dewey, the leading progressive in the 20th century easily, and Herbert Crowley, whose book, The Promise of American Life, was also a major contributor to the progressive movement. So those are the two. You got them. Go ahead.
Right. And now I was going to say, Doctor, that another common denominator is Darwin, and the implementing the ideas of evolution and natural selection, biological evolution, into every other area of the social sciences. Correct?
Especially through Herbert Spencer, who brought Darwinism to the social sciences and led to a lot of different movements, including eugenics and Margaret Sanger and everything, who was a progressive herself, but only in the sense that Darwin's idea of the survival of the fittest was attributed to capitalism, as if anyone who supports capitalism couldn't care less about anyone who's left by the wayside or left to starve in a cold winter tenement, because that's the survival of the fittest. But that was never really a strong argument made by those who wanted to defend capitalism through the late 19th and 20th century, like William Graham Sumner. So that was an argument that capitalism's enemies were easily able to attribute, which gave capitalists a bad name. You're just greedy, selfish, in a dog-eat-dog society where everyone's looking out for number one, which was a complete fiction and never described America.
Right. And isn't it ironic, Jerome, that Columbia University would invite the German Jewish people who made up the composition of the Frankfurt School just prior, or really with the beginning of Hitler's reign of terror in Nazi Germany, correct?
Yes, they escaped Germany, came to America. Many of them settled at Columbia University, but many of them settled at the school that gave me my PhD, the New School for Social Research. I studied with many teachers in the late 80s and 90s who brought the ideas of the Frankfurt School to the United States. And that's why the economics department, the philosophy department was completely dominated at the new school by the Frankfurt philosophy. Not so much a political science for a while, which is why I was able to get out by the skin of my teeth with a PhD. But boy, did I meet some nasty characters in my experience and my graduate studies.
Fascinating. And we've said, we've also informed people that really the objective, there are 4 objectives in view with the Frankfurt School. And we also see it with the progressives. In many respects, they want to eliminate Judeo-Christianity, eliminate the family, the nucleus of the traditional family structure. They want to eliminate the Constitution, and they want to eliminate the idea or the reality of private property. Wouldn't you say that's accurate, Jerome?
Every bit of that is accurate. I just sent out a tweet a couple days ago. Will somebody please ask Joe Biden if he agrees with eliminating the nuclear family? Because so many of his fellow travelers are looking to do exactly that. Let him try to sell that to the American people.
That's very true. And we're going to continue to talk about the cultural Marxism, the Frankfurt School, the influences of the progressive movement. But Jerome, I want to talk a little bit about John Locke for this first episode that we're going to do together. Of course, he lived from 1632 to 1704. Now, one of his early essays, if I'm not mistaken, was called An Essay Concerning Human Understanding, which is basically an epistemological study where John Locke was talking about critical thinking. Is that true?
Absolutely. And the key to that is, unlike any philosopher after Aristotle and after St. Thomas Aquinas, he was the philosopher who identified the fact that all human understanding begins with the evidence of reality provided by our 5 senses. That is where it begins. And he developed a theory of concepts, how we get from our perception of reality to the process by which we form concepts. And he showed that our concepts are directly tied to our perceptions if we think carefully and critically, and so that the principles we form from our concepts can be reduced directly to the evidence of reality provided by our senses, including a moral philosophy that tells us how we ought to live. And a good deal of his essay concerning human understanding is validating the virtues that were common to the Enlightenment culture. And he did that. That was one of his great contributions. His letter concerning toleration was a masterpiece in explaining the virtue of tolerance and why we need to respect free thought and opinion, which is something else that is being destroyed by the progressive left. They have no use for free thought and expression, and political correctness and the cancel culture is what they use to destroy Americans' ability to stand on their own feet, to look at the world through their own eyes, and form their own conclusions. That is the gravest, in my opinion, that's the gravest danger of all. There is nothing left once we are not allowed to use our minds or state what is plainly in front of our faces.
Yes, very, very provocative thinking. And isn't it true, Jerome, that over the course of time, our public education systems and our institutes of higher education have eliminated critical thinking? And it's basically a dictation for people to accept what they're being taught as opposed to critique it, correct?
Technically, it's called indoctrination. It is what
Right.
every aspiring tyrant will impose. We have the examples of Mao's China, of Stalin's Soviet Union, of Hitler's Germany, and now we are seeing it in the United States. I speak to students literally every day who are totally cowed into mimicking the words and thoughts of their professors, lest they fail their courses, lest they be denounced, lest they lose credit for the courses they've taken. It is a disaster, and this is going on in college classrooms all over the country. And I don't know if this nation will withstand 2 more generations of this kind of indoctrination from our schools. Because don't forget, it's the college professors who teach our teachers. And this is what's taking place in our secondary schools, even down to the grade school level, learning to hate America and learning everything that's wrong with America and not learning anything about the greatness of America and how unprecedented it was to found a nation on the principle of individual rights. And that is being lost. And then you see these students getting their news reports from the mainstream media, which is not at all news, and their minds are totally destroyed and unable to fathom reality. And I have those conversations every day also. They listen to CNBC or NBC, ABC, CBS and all, read the New York Times, the Washington Post, and they literally believe they are hearing the news, and nothing could be further from the truth.
Right. And wasn't it John Dewey, Jerome, that moved education away from the individual as far as the talents and the peculiar and special, unique talents that the individual may have, and rather incorporate a general overall view of the collective whole and the part that the person plays in the collective whole? Isn't that one of the staples of the John Dewey decimal system, if you will?
That is indeed a staple of John Dewey's progressive education. You are part of a group. Your purpose is to fit in with the group, not to stand out, not to pursue your individual initiative and pursue your talents, but to fit in with the group, to get along, to go along, to get along. And that was part and parcel of progressive education from the 1950s and 60s especially, and it's that way today. Teachers very, very often these days have no patience for a student that questions their authority or their point of view. That is a very sad state, and it's the state of modern education, and John Dewey was its founder.
Yes, no question. And it's interesting to note, Jerome, that obviously men like Benjamin Franklin and William Penn were very influenced in reading Locke's letter concerning toleration in establishing the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And what the letter contained, and I want you to elaborate on this, John Locke was talking about the separation of church and state, but that idea of separation in church of state is very, very different from what the Supreme Court decisions in 1962 and 1963, in which they used language that Thomas Jefferson used in writing to a congregation in Connecticut, and essentially talking about the fact that there should be no state church. There should be no Church of England, that the leader or the king is not, shouldn't be the sovereign. There's no state church as opposed to all of the different denominations. Isn't that an accurate description of the intent of
That
the
is
original.
very accurate. Hey, John Robert, I don't know why you need me on this conversation. You have captured so much of the truth of things, although I can confirm what you've been saying. But that is true. You see, here in Locke's day, the idea was that if someone differs from the king in matters of religion, they would just as easily differ with the king in matters of politics and ethics. So they had to suppress any recalcitrant religion, any dissenting religion. So that after King Henry VIII, if you weren't a member of the Anglican Church, you were regarded as a dissenter, a sectarian, and someone who was dangerous. What John Locke did in his letter of toleration said the only danger to a government or to a country doesn't come from tolerance, it comes from intolerance. In other words, once you tell people they can't practice their religion, you create an enemy. You create someone who would stand before God against the church. But if once you allow all of the any person to pursue the religion of his choice, you don't outlaw a religion. You leave intolerance behind. There's nothing for anyone to complain about or to raise arms against his king, because he has the freedom to practice what he wants. And by the 18th century in America, because there were so many different religious denominations in every colony, you could not have one denomination that was powerful enough to impose its view of God and reading of the Bible on other people. So by necessity and by John Locke's reasoning, we arrived at the concept of freedom of religion, religious liberty, and it was understood that as long as you allow religious liberty, you're not in danger of insurrection or rebellion. And you're absolutely right in that the only thing the Constitution prevents is the establishment of a state religion, because that leads to intolerance. Just allow people to practice their faith in freedom, and you eliminate the problem of insurrection, rebellion, or discontent.
Right. And I believe William Penn was the man who described it as freedom of conscience, correct?
Yes, William Penn and Roger Williams in Rhode Island were the two leading proponents of toleration and had an enormous influence in the development of the culture of the colonies.
Right. And let me ask you this, Jerome, did John Locke believe in the doctrine of original sin, that we're born sinners?
Yes. John Locke was a Christian. Now, you can arrive at Locke's moral and political principles without reference to religion or to God, because he was an Enlightenment thinker. And just to press this point home, because it's a very important point, he said, the state of nature has a law of nature to govern it, and reason, which is that law, teaches all mankind who will but consult it, that being all equal and independent, no one ought to harm another in his health, liberty, or possessions. His life, health, liberty, or possessions. So right from the reliance on independent reason, unaided reason unaided by faith, you have all the principles to fashion the Declaration of Independence. But Locke himself was a devout Christian. He was a what was called a lower order Anglican, not a high Anglican who wanted to impose intolerance. He was a low order Anglican, and he absolutely believed in God, believed in the doctrines of the Christian faith, and in original sin.
Right, and he was raised a Puritan, so that would certainly make sense. But as we come to the conclusion of the show, Doctor, I want for you to make mention of which probably is the most famous of John Locke's works, and the one that obviously had the greatest influence on the founders, and that's the Second Treatise of Government. And it is within the Treatise of Government, the Second Treatise of Government, that the Locke started to expound upon the sovereignty of the people, the legitimacy of government and its nature, and natural rights in the social contract, correct?
That is of course correct. I would correct one thing though. What's very interesting and very little known or appreciated is the fact that there were thousands of Americans who learned the principles of the Second Treatise of Government. Government is instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, as Jefferson wrote in the Declaration, who never heard of John Locke, who never read a page, a paragraph of John Locke. What is
that right?
little appreciated is that there were a long line of writers all across the 18th century who corresponded with the American colonists, who wrote broadsides, newspaper essays, books, and through these broadsides and essays and sermons and books, they transmitted Locke's philosophy so that you didn't have to read Locke's high philosophy to understand everything Locke was teaching.
Remarkable.
Let me leave you and your interviewers with a very interesting formulation that, again, is very little understood and appreciated. So as I just said, Jefferson wrote, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. But the implication of that is that if there are powers or rights that the people themselves do not possess, then they are powers they cannot delegate to government. In other words, I have no right to give away or take away what belongs to you. You have no right to give away or take away what belongs to me. That is a power none of us can give to government so that government can claim to benefit one class or faction or family of individuals at others' expense. In other words, Locke's philosophy, properly understood, relegates government to the incredibly important role of protector, but does not allow it to become a provider. And Locke himself had very, very clear language. Let me point to paragraph 135 in his Second Treatise of Government, where he says very specifically how much power governments acquire from the people, and that no legislature can acquire any more power because the people never had that power themselves, never had the power to redistribute wealth or property or possessions that don't belong to them. That's a very, very important point and was totally overlooked. Because it was overlooked very early on, we inaugurated what came to be called the corporate welfare state, and it was the failure not of laissez-faire free market capitalism, but the failure of corporate welfare policies that eventually led to the quote-unquote need and demand for social welfare reforms from the Progressive Era to the New Deal down to today. That's the tragedy of our history, as I call it in my new book.
Well, we're certainly going to be looking forward to the new book, Jerome. And of course, you mentioned Locke's philosophy that government should be a protector, correlates perfectly with what I read George F. Will say in his recent book, The Conservative Sensibility, that the most important verb in the Declaration of Independence is the word secure. And of course, protecting and securing and security and securing of our natural rights, the unalienable God-given rights of life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. So that's a perfect correlation with that, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. And it's not just the first duty of government to secure us in the enjoyment of what is ours, our lives, our liberties, and our possessions, but according to the reasoning I just gave, it's the only purpose for which government exists. It exists for no other purpose. Of course, that came to a close very early on, unfortunately, in the nation's history. And the principle here is something every one of us learned right after 9/11. If we don't feel safe, we cannot feel free.
Right.
And that is what the country is learning all over again in Seattle and Minneapolis and Portland and Chicago and in portions of New York.
Right. In those cities, we actually see a state of nature, correct? Total lawlessness.
Exactly. Reliance on heaven to do what government is utterly failing to do. And what that shows is that the progressive movement is a perilous threat to the safety, security, and happiness of the American people. And the radicals, the looters and rioters who are sacking our cities, they are the militant wing of the progressive movement, but there are moderate progressives who don't riot. They run for public office, and they are totally fine with the looting, the rioting, because they are doing everything in their power to prevent law enforcement from imposing justice on the rioters and the sackers who are pillaging our communities and leaving innocent populations in terror. Now, I've always been a contrarian, so this might be the best thing that could happen to this country in the long run, because it's finally showing the people, exposing how dangerous a philosophy, how dangerous a movement progressivism is. And that's being underscored by the fact that gun shops cannot keep their merchandise on their shelves these days.
So true. Well, Jerome, this has been an invigorating and very stimulating conversation. And we want to continue to talk to you on a monthly basis, because there's so much that we need to talk about and we'll talk about. But as we close, I want to give the audience information on how they can find you on Facebook. The American Declaration, is that a group? Is that the group page?
Yes, that is a group. I now have 1,600 members in the group, actively participating, commenting, sharing the posts that I put there. Practically daily, I'm adding new posts and circulating my ideas, and these ideas are as important as anything that is being said in the country today, in my opinion, from not only my experience, communication skills, but also from the education I gave myself as to the nature of the founding era. But what I would emphasize is the importance of reaching the common men and women of the country, the low information voters, as Rush Limbaugh called them, the silent majority, as Spiro Agnew, that these are the people who must be reached. And I have developed, and I put in my posts, specific appeals that they can relate to. In other words, I don't expect most Americans to pick up a copy of John Locke's essay concerning human understanding, or to involve themselves in deep philosophical matters. I do expect them to understand the importance of free thought and expression and the danger of the intolerance that's taking place. I expect them to understand that heavy, burdensome taxations do nothing but destroy civilizations, and that's what the progressives have in store for us, a taxation by which the economy cannot endure. That's something the average American can understand and can use to decide who he's going to vote for. In other words, Joe Biden right away say the first thing he's going to rescind are Donald Trump's tax cuts. But those tax cuts, reducing the corporate tax, for example, from 35% down to 22%, is exactly what caused the American economy to boom since 2017 when it took office. So in other words, there are issues. People understand the importance of security, as we said, the importance of being able to keep the money they earn, especially when it's just being poured down rat holes that do no one any good whatsoever. So these are the issues I'm with the American Declaration. I'm trying to bring home to the American people and gradually wean them onto the deeper philosophical issues once I think they have a grasp of what is and is not in their personal private interests, and how the two parties are so opposed, one being good for them and one being very, very bad for them.
Right. And of course, I became familiar with you as a result of your posts. And we want to cross-pollinate with you, Jerome, the New Jersey Constitutional Republicans, the American Declaration. We are joined forces, and we want to educate and help educate. So please cross-pollinate with our group and post at will in our group. And we'd like to be able to share the work that we're doing with your group. And I'm very excited about the relationship that I'm cultivating with you. And I really look forward to the future. And I invite.
Likewise, I look very much forward to meeting with your group once we are able to get into a meeting hall and exchange our views and an opportunity to meet your members and answer their questions and everything, because this country is desperate for a nationwide movement to take this country back. And I see your posts, I know your work, and you are one of the groups out there that if America is to be saved, it will be because of good men and good women and good groups like you are putting in the field and I am putting in the field.
Yes, well, I appreciate that, Jerome, very much. And I want the audience, as we conclude, to go and get Locke in America, the Moral Philosophy of the Founding Era. It's on Amazon. I looked at it, and I've already got mine ordered, and I can't wait to read it. And I want people to read Dr. Jerome Huyler's book entitled Locke in America, the Moral Philosophy of the Founding Era. So we'll be back with another virtual conversation in another month, Doctor, with you, and we'll look forward to that. And thank you very much for joining me today.
I do very much look forward to that, and thank you so very much, John Robert.
Thank you. Thanks to all of our listeners and viewers today. Please share this video. There's a lot of great information that was given. Dr. Jerome Huyler was our guest today, and I'm very appreciative for him coming on. And you're going to want to share this information with your fellow citizens, family members. So we'll conclude the program as we always do and talk about the phrase that we believe in, the Constitutional Republicans, and what Abraham Lincoln said, which was liberty for all. Thank you very much. Good night.
So long.
Thank you, Doctor.
Thank you.